returning violence for violence, multiples violence, adding deeper and darkness to a night already devoid of stars. This quote was said by Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most amazing people who tried to abolish capital punishment, but still had not succeeded before his death. He was wanting to abolish the death penalty because it was absurd and cruel. In this presentation, I am going to talk about why I agree with Martin Luther King Jr. and why I think the death penalty should be abolished. On October 10th, 2010 is a day that is called World Day Against the Death Penalty. It focuses on this year in the USA. There has never been a more important or better time to get involved in ending capital punishment in the United States. Here are a couple reasons why, in a scholarly article that I agree on, think that the death penalty is absurd and cruel. For one, putting a man on the death penalty just days after saving his life is a perfect illustration of why the death penalty is absurd and cruel. If you're going to save his life just to kill him in front of hundreds of people for them to watch, just because of what they have done, is absurd. I, for one, don't think that's right. If you're going to save his life, then why are you going to kill him again? Also, the death penalty is very, very degrading. It's very degrading even to a criminal. For one, you can watch a death penalty. You can go in and sit in the room and you can talk about and see the person being killed. They can either have a lethal injection, which is the most common, and the crowd can see as the person withers away and dies first, and I think that's degrading. It's bad because, it's on record and stating you should be using a lot of the drugs that they are using, like lethal injections, for purposes to heal. And that right there is not good for people who have been using also, because they're seeing that these drugs are used to kill others, and now substance abusers are now saying, oh, I can kill myself from this because the death penalty is showing me that I can use this because they are using these on people to kill them. So that is another reason why I'm against the death penalty, because it's using these substances not for healing purposes and overdosing to make them die. There is a lot going on with the death penalty in profile cases that have a lot to do with racial undertones, and they create a lot of political pressure that can lead to a lot of police and prosecutor misconduct. There was actually a person, his name was Reggie Clemens, and he was convicted as an compliance in the murder of 2 white women in St. Louis. 4 federal judges have agreed that the prosecutor's conduct was abusive and boorish, and Clemens alleges police brutality during his questioning. Witnesses attested Clemens' face being swollen after his integration. So therefore, something had happened after that we did not get the whole story from Clemens, which maybe had something to do with police brutality. Something could have happened before. Nobody knows what truly did happen, but I do think that all people have the right to say something before they are prosecuted to death. I think that everyone has the freedom of speech, whether they are convicted of a crime or not. That is just my opinion. It's also, the death penalty is not limited to the worst of the worst. There's a lot of people who have been put to the death penalty because of things that I don't think really should have been on the death penalty. So an example would be a woman named Teresa Lewis from Virginia. On September 23rd, she was put to the death as a mastermind of a crime despite her 72 IQ and despite the fact that the men who actually carried out the crime did not get the death penalty. So she was put to the death penalty because of her IQ and her mastermind, because she had the mastermind of the IQ of 72, she had to be put to death because people had assumed that it was her because she was so smart in creating this murder. The death penalty is not limited to cases where there is no doubt and guilt. Convicted by flimsy witness testimony and unable to exonerate himself with those same witnesses, Troy Davis remains on death row despite serious doubts about his guilt. So there are so many people that are still on death row even though there's doubt and guilt in there. Nothing has been proved for it, and it's crazy. People are put on death row and they sit on death row for many, many years even, and no one's even trying to get their case figured out, or nobody is trying to help them, which I think it's crazy, because then as a person sitting in death row, you are still feeling guilty and you're feeling sick to your stomach. And especially if you didn't commit these crimes and you are being, you're still being held on death row and you did not commit the crimes and nobody's willing to help you, I also think that is something that is a problem. I do think that death row is awful. I do not think that people should be like that. And I do think if someone does commit a crime so bad, why are we putting them to death? Why are we sitting there putting them out of their misery? If someone is being murdered, why are we not letting them sit in jail and think about what they did for the rest of their life with no help? Why are we not doing that? We are putting them out of their misery by putting them on death row. If they are convicted of an awful thing, I think that they need to sit there and do it. Think about it. Because if you were to do something so awful, you need to sit there and you need to think about your actions, in my opinion. Because, I mean, if I had ever done something wrong, I need to sit and think about it to learn from my consequences. Not even saying that these people are going to learn from it, but they need to sit there and they need to think about it. All in all, Martin Luther King Jr. did say, returning violence for violence, multiples violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoted. I do agree with him. Returning violence for violence, multiples violence. Nobody wants violence. And the death penalty is all about violence. And that is why I think that the death penalty should be abolished.
The death penalty is a fair, just, and humane punishment. Gary Ray Bowles was executed by lethal injection in a Florida prison on August 22, 2019. Bowles was a serial killer responsible for taking the lives of 6 gay men in 8 months' time. Society is not safe with killers like Bowles alive, regardless of whether they're spending life in prison or they're out in public. In 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed the constitutionality of the death penalty, and since 1977, more than 1,480 people have been executed. Most of those were murderers of other people. The death penalty is a fair and just punishment. It's a major deterrent to serious crimes such as murder and terrorism, and it has become more humane over the last several years. My intentions of speaking with you today are to prove these points to you and convince you that the death penalty is needed as a punishment for the most serious crimes of murder and terrorism. As I said earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed the constitutionality of the death penalty in 1976. The United States is one of 55 countries globally that have a legal death penalty. As of March 24th, 2021, this year, 27 states in the U.S. have a legal death penalty phase. And 3 of those states have current moratoriums, which means they don't do executions right now because the moratorium is preventing that. You know, victims' families, they require retribution for having to go through losing a loved one because of murderers like Bowles. You know, an eye for an eye philosophy is appropriate. The punishment should fit the crime. You know, the death penalty is needed for moral balance to the wrong done by the criminal. And it's needed also because families need closure. Families of the victims need closure, and they need to move on. And they don't need to live in fear of the criminal getting out of prison, even if they've got a life sentence in prison. A harsher penalty is needed for criminals who commit the worst crimes, such as taking somebody else's life. You know, life without parole is not harsh enough, not a harsh enough punishment for murderers and terrorists. It's just not, it doesn't make common sense. You know, to deter capital crimes like murder, a harsher penalty is needed to discourage these people from doing those acts. You know, the federal death penalty has been carried out 16 times since its reinstatement in 1988. Twice in 2001, once in 2003, 10 times in 2020, and 3 times in 2021. President Joe Biden has enacted a moratorium currently on the death penalty which reverses President Donald Trump's old policy. And proponents of the death penalty argue that justice must be carried out to deter the crimes and offer closure, as I said earlier, to the families. You know, the death penalty has become more humane punishment over the last several years with medical advances in the way executions are carried out. A medical professional participates in the execution to ensure that the injections are administered properly and renders medical aid should anything arise as far as an emergency. The methods of execution have become quick, painless, and humane over the years since it was legalized. Capital punishment is a highly controversial issue, and many people are divided on the subject. People in the United States have the freedom to choose whether they are for or against the death penalty. I've spoken to you today to make you aware of the reasons the death penalty is direly needed, to keep society safe from dangerous criminals like Bowles or other terrorists and murderers. If you were one of the family members of the victims that Bowles sexually assaulted and killed, would you want him to spend life in prison, or would you want to show him the same treatment that he showed to as many victims? Criminals that dangerous deserve nothing less than what they gave to their victims, which is absolutely no mercy. If I've managed to convince you of the advantages of the death penalty, then I pass the torch over to you to start exercising your right of public advocacy. The goal is to get more states to legalize the death penalty and to get the federal government to end the moratorium on federal executions. Thank you for your time.